Hello, my name is Louise Haagh. I'm giving this talk from Britain. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today to join you all in Seoul. But I'm going to talk today about the justice and feasibility of basic income in times of crisis. And I'm going to talk about what we can learn from recent crises, specifically COVID, about basic income in a wider systemic sense. Because we tend to think that the feasibility of basic income is a variable, and what we can learn from the crisis is about feasibility, but that the justice of basic income is fixed, and we may have different views about what the justice case for basic income is, but that this is sort of somewhat separate, and the feasibility comes afterwards. But to my mind, the justice of basic income really forms part of developmental justice generally. Basic income is not just on its own, and the feasibility of this form of justice is linked with developmental governance. And of course, these arguments are essentially the arguments of my book from 2029. And so what does it mean? Well, I think it means that I don't think basic income can be just in the same way in a neoliberal society, where in essence it's propping up structural injustice, as it might be in societies with more extensive solidaristic arrangements. And so you might say, in counter to this, well, if the basic income is high, in theory, what does it matter what the rest of society looks like? Isn't the point of a basic income and not only that it should be high enough to allow us to choose what to do, but that anyone can choose, we can then get together and interact with each other and create the sort of society that we want. But I think it's evident that the basic income will never be high under neoliberalism. And we live in the era of neoliberalism, we live in the realm of neoliberalism, even if we don't live in a homegrown neoliberal society. So that's another way in which I think entirely divorcing feasibility from justice gets quite difficult. And so both systemically and in terms of outcomes for individuals, basic income is not equally just. And I think COVID helped us see these relationships more clearly, not that they were not there before, but in a dynamic situation. Some of the relationships that I'm thinking about are brought out into the open. So what developmental justice is, first of all, is complex. It's linked with having one's needs met in terms of human development by the institutions of the society, how they are progressively structured and designed. And so when it comes to COVID, the degree economic security was reliable and commensurate with needs at such a time for different groups is a good indicator of the state of developmental justice in the society. While developmental governance, on the other hand, refers in very general terms to planned and long-term approaches to the design of institutions and policies, and for government to have and to exercise this capability, which incidentally I think is associated with a propensity to try and aim for lowering inequality in society. When government doesn't have developmental capabilities, that propensity, as well as that capacity, of course, is much weaker. So I'm going to argue that countries with developmental governance were better able to do justice to people under COVID, and there are lessons for basic income there. So to illustrate the significance of developmental capability, I'm going to make 5 points in relation to COVID about neoliberalism and versus developmental governance, about employment outcomes, about forms of economic security coverage, about innovations in income security systems during COVID, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions. And I'm going to concentrate on rich countries that are heavily neoliberalized, on the one hand, including Britain, and others, on the other hand, with strong developmental capabilities, including Korea and Nordic states. These cases, of course, also happen to be in economic terms some of the worst and best COVID performers, not only in economic terms, also in health, but I'm going to focus on the economy. So in relation to COVID, I want to focus on two aspects of developmental governance capacity, including government-level coordination, and secondly, risk pooling. And this includes levels of tax and GDP, but also government-supported systems of social savings that in different ways enhance the ability of society or groups in society to transparently co-govern and exercise some kind of democratic accountability over development and how funding and economic security systems are used and evolve. And I suggest that there is a relationship between these two, that between risk pooling and governance coordination, meaning that both are likely to be higher or lower in the same society. And there's a dynamic relationship as well in terms of up or down scaling effects over time. And neoliberalism tends to engineer downscaling effects. This, of course, depends on different factors again, such as whether neoliberalism was homegrown and the degree of past developmental capability. So, for example, in South Korea, neoliberalism was broadly imposed from the outside in a context of high capability. Creeping neoliberalism with the attempt to accede to the OECD, with financial liberalization, which was a contributing factor to the 1997 crisis, and then after the 1997 crisis, IMF bailouts and conditions that came with that. But the existence, the prior existence of developmental capability is important, I think, to understand how, despite IMF intervention, Korea defied neoliberalism in some very important ways by converting its developmental capabilities after 1997 and retaining some of the old ones. And one of the examples of conversion is remarkable, nearly 30%, actually 50% over a longer period rise of the level of taxation in GDP in a span of about 15 years. And also, in the same period, the rise of over 300% of spending on social protection, specifically income transfers of different types in Korea, which I think is unprecedented in a neoliberal era. Although from a low level, nevertheless, if you compare with the Nordic states, for example, which sat with Britain at the end of the 1960s and then expanded their tax base quite radically during the 1970s and retained a different status from Britain after that, even if there was some lowering of tax, income taxes, especially in Sweden. Nevertheless, these countries stayed ahead, as it were. I think Korea's transformation in the neoliberal era is comparably more remarkable. And I think some of these new mechanisms are key factors in Korea's remarkable COVID performance, alongside with governance capabilities linked with the democratization process, including the experiments that have taken place at lower levels of government. On the other hand, I think the problem with especially homegrown neoliberalism is that as it evolves, it cuts off its own legs. It not only disempowers lower levels of government, which we've seen at the level of funding in the UK, for example, has been halved during the period of neoliberalism, but also neoliberal economies generate a weaker tax base and yet require ever greater government subsidy of the real economy, not just jobs, but also privatized services. And this drives a downscaling effect between capability and pooling in neoliberal states, which makes neoliberalism self-destructive. And I think this played out under COVID. So neoliberal countries tended to pursue what I call the sugar rush approach. They delayed action because their capability was lower and their exposure was greater, which generated paralysis, as in Britain. By the time lockdown was imposed, society was in crisis, so the need for rushing in longer lockdowns, higher spending, followed by greater recession, generating greater fiscal deficits and restraints in the long run. Governance capability tends instead to promote the turtle approach, early, thoughtful action that entailed less wasted energy, meaning either less spend, as in Denmark, or Korea also comparably spent less in terms of foregone fiscal revenue and direct fiscal revenue, or more effective spend, as in both Korea and Denmark. And Denmark's lockdown, of course, was announced many weeks before Britain's and had a clear tripartite government economic framework in place before it began. Schools were closed for a matter of weeks compared with Britain's nearly 6 months. Here I'm talking about the first wave of COVID. While in Britain, GDP fell by 22.1% in the second quarter of 2020. In the same quarter, Danish and Korean GDP fell by 6.8% and 3.2%, with the US at 9% in between there. Employment recovery in different countries also followed a similar pattern. In South Korea, it was timed at around the third quarter of 2021, Denmark about a year later, and Britain's and the US has been estimated at the fourth quarter of 2023, so we're not even there yet. And I could go on with general economic performance data, but you get the gist, I think. So this takes us to the next point, which concerns the way that the impact of these outcomes were mediated within economic security systems. And we need here to keep in mind two groups of people, the quarter or one-third of the labour market that is more vulnerable in every country. How much more vulnerable, of course, is important, but nevertheless, you find this sort of stratification in every country. And how other groups' cost of living is supported in a crisis as well. Britain was, in these terms, a case of high but relative ineffective spending if you consider the needs of these groups. The UK and the US direct fiscal spend in GDP was about 20 and 25% respectively in 2020, while it was just over 3% in Denmark, around 5% or less in other Nordic states, and around 7% in Korea. This is just foregone fiscal revenue, direct fiscal revenue, not loan guarantees and some other outlays of that nature. And partly this differential spend, this immediate fiscal pressure, was driven by the effect of delays, of course, but other factors in terms of how it impacted on people. The design of income security systems was very important. So in the UK, there was a 29% rise in claims to the universal credit, the flat income assistance system that the UK has in a 5-week period between April and May of 2020, the very important period, which may look like a success in terms of the ability of the system to incorporate people quite quickly, but really it wasn't, given the puny coverage and the means test as well. The puny coverage in terms of 40% of an average wage, which is one of the worst levels of coverage in the OECD in terms of average coverage of income security systems. Now, if you take all transfers, including housing benefits and so on, the UK fares rather well. But if you take just the cash component, that's a different story. And of course, Britain has no unemployment insurance system. So the cost of furlough, which is the equivalent to unemployment insurance effectively, is felt entirely on the British government, on the fiscal system, while people with assets who lost their jobs or hours who weren't on furlough were not necessarily covered by any income scheme. So no wonder the government was scared of imposing lockdown because of the lack of preparedness and the risks to people that this would entail. And I'd argue that both of these groups that I identified before, they suffered comparatively within the UK's neoliberal model relative to these other countries I'm looking at. So in Denmark, where unemployment insurance covers about 2/3 of the unemployed normally, the number of people receiving public economic assistance of some kind rose by about 6.5% and fell again by 3.3% the following year. So 6.5 in 2020 and then falling the next year. And I think the existence of this prior risk pooling mechanisms that the government could rely on, draw on, was an important factor. And also, this is the case in Korea. Before the pandemic, Korea had achieved a rate of coverage of its EI system of 96% among regular employees. Of course, this is a privileged group, and a much lower rate, nearly 63% among irregular employees. And this is an unfortunate differential that is a historic differential, that reflects a historic differential between categories of workers in South Korea. And this, of course, is unacceptable. But nevertheless, and this is important, coverage for both groups was very high compared with other countries in a system only implemented in 1995. And I think this is important. And I think also in South Korea, there's evidence of an upscaling effect between systems, with assistance being too low in South Korea, of course, but nevertheless, I think other new approaches that were tried out during COVID is going to mean that there might be an impetus for change across economic security systems, as I'm going to discuss. South Korea began implementing economic support measures already in January 2020, 2 months before countries in Europe, and over the next 3 months, the government decreed 3 successive significant increases in economic support. First, to incentivize take-up of the employment insurance system, with employee compensation rising for other workers unemployed. The other side of 2/3 to 3/3 to 9/10 of wage cost over these 3 months. While in December 2020, coverage was extended to subcontractor workers, which is a move that has to some extent been maintained, or an impetus that has been maintained, as I'll discuss in a moment. And the system was able to move existing funds for training, these are earmarked funds that were already there, part of the shared security system, over to employment retention, which went from 12.8% of spending within the system to 27% in 2020. And much of that was then able to be pooled from the shared savings that existed. But not only this, I think South Korea's overall economic support package was diversified, and it was quite generous by international standards. The government spent on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, nearly 3 times of the subsidies that it gave to the unemployment insurance system. Of course, it was partly able to do that because of the existence of the unemployment insurance system. The SME sector employed many of the precarious workers. And in March 2020, the government extended a childcare leave scheme or benefit to single parents who could, so that they did not have to work when school or daycare centres were closed. Nothing like this existed, of course, in the UK, where many people work from home at the same time as trying to educate their children. South Korea expanded the level of job seekers' benefit from 50% of the average wage to 60%, which compares very favorably even with the British rate, as I already mentioned. Now, in Denmark, the ceiling for UI payments is about 3/4 of average earnings, but of course it's higher for lower earners, approximately 90% of the previous wage, which is an important part of the solidaristic composition of that system, the fact that it has some government subsidy and the way that it's structured to compensate those at the lower end of the wage scale, which is really important when you compare them with privatized UI systems or individual accounts UI systems like in neoliberal Chile, for example, which is inadequate for low-wage workers and doesn't really work. Now, assistance, as I mentioned, in South Korea is too low. It's 30% of the median income, which is not enough. But if we take, again, only cash and not housing subsidies, it's still larger, significantly larger than the UK's in pure cash terms. And I think, given that it's a system only started in 1995, and there's now a debate about extending coverage to low-income workers or irregular workers in South Korea, there's scope for raising that benefit and for arguing for that in combination with arguing for a basic income floor in the form of a basic income. The important point here, though, when we think in systemic terms, is that unemployment insurance benefits are not asset tested or means tested, while assistance is. So in neoliberal states with these flat systems that have asset or mean tests, more groups, typically, of course, benefits being very low, as I just mentioned, all groups suffer under that sort of system. So what I'm saying here is that neoliberalism really cut government capacity and coverage of needs in Britain by flattening its welfare state. And this needs to be borne in mind when you think about, well, what's going to succeed universal credit? Is it going to be a purely flat system, or is it going to be a system that offers other opportunities for savings as well and wider coverage? So the benefit, I think, potentially of combining a basic income with some form of employment and unemployment insurance in Korea, which already has this system, is that none of these systems would be asset or means tested, which is very important for developmental justice, the ability for people to control their economic circumstances in a dynamic sense. And there are also lessons, I think, from South Korea in terms of its process of democratizations, from the way in which lessons or experiments done at the municipal or regional level were upscaled during the COVID crisis. And I'm thinking of course, Korea's basic income scheme for youth and farmers from Gyeonggi province, and the inspiration that gave to new systems during COVID. Specifically, South Korea was one of the first countries to implement a quasi-basic income emergency policy, as we all know, by distributing food vouchers to be consumed locally to the whole population. Began in May 2020, and I've heard that the Gyeonggi province scheme was very significant inspiration and evidence base for that approach. So while not a basic income, I mean, the latter measure was nonetheless equal, it was universal, it was essentially non-conditional. Of course, it was in the form of a food voucher, so if you're a stickler, it's not unconditional, but that was justified, I think, on good grounds during the crisis, because it also helped support local businesses and farmers as well. So this one-time universal transfer made up almost 20% of additional spend, and it served to sustain, as I said, consumption and local restaurants and shops serving local or selling local produce. It was originally going to be rich tested with the top 30% on the income scale, as I understand it, but it was made universal. Low-income households received the grant automatically, while others had to apply, unfortunate from the perspective of basic income. Or they could donate their share, which 2% did, to the unemployment, or the employment rather, insurance system, which I think is an interesting crossover there. And very importantly, the government was able to make the transfers to 96% of households within 1 month. So the pilots that have been going on in South Korea inspired this, and then this experience will provide, again, evidence and I think a basis for further campaigns for non-means tested income security in South Korea. After COVID, so we've seen already, there's been experiments now with several food voucher pilots. Again, it's not cash grant scheme, but these run alongside, as I understand it, income assistance. They're not a replacement for cash grants. So you see like a diversification of instruments of economic security that are considering livelihoods as well as income needs. It's not like US food vouchers, because that can be spent on more widely, but they target healthy and nationally produced food. Some people say this is conditional, but I think it's also part of the green transition that we're all hoping for, and I think therefore very important. But also innovations have occurred in the UI system as well, which shows that this sort of trade-off between innovations in one part or one type of income assistance system is a trade-off to other innovations. That is not the case in real terms, in real political terms. It's not the case. The Korean government, with social partners, sat down very early on and set down a roadmap for coverage of the employment insurance system of all workers in South Korea by 2025, starting with artists, December 2020, during COVID, of course, and then moving to dependent contractors, July 2021, platform workers, January 2022, other workers, July 2022, and self-employed workers by 2025. And the idea is to use social dialogue to devise the conditions. And of course, these things are subject to political capture and reversals, but I think nonetheless, we've seen a proliferation of innovations during COVID in South Korea. So I want to conclude on 3 points then. First, I think that the COVID crisis has shown the upscaling effects that exist within developmental governance systems between different forms of economic protection and innovation, and that they are important for developmental justice outcomes. Not perfect outcomes, but moving in the direction of developmental justice. I think basic income supporters should embrace the notion of a basic income floor as part of this form of developmental governance and innovation. And second, they listen to Korea's own traditions rather than what global organizations are saying, because to my mind, they are advocating downscaling, not upscaling of economic security systems. And this, of course, has been going on for a long time. And so the OECD, for example, before the pandemic, recommended for South Korea to get rid of employment protections and flatten its income security system to create fairness and productivity. It's a standard neoliberal line. Quote, breaking down dualism requires reducing employment protection for regular workers. And this is being argued everywhere. But deregulating and flattening will do neither of those things. It will not create fairness, or it will dumb down fairness at best. And it will not increase productivity. And we would just have to look at Korea's high growth period, and innovation has come about in a very composite and complex economic security system, not a flat one. And we've seen where a flat one tends in Britain. The punitive meager benefits that no one can actually live on, and with workloads for everyone that are off the chart, no one has control over the process. So on the one hand, as the OECD rightly notes, the fact that a lower share, that's 73% according to their figures, of irregular workers, but at that time was covered by employment insurance in Korea, it's problematic, given that the workers are in precarious jobs. But the OECD is actually arguing for expanding precariousness to more workers, is not arguing for upscaling or bringing in workers within a more protected regime for all. So I think there are important lessons there, that we should not accept a basic income as a source of passively encasing and accepting contemporary neoliberal trends to isolated online working or casualization in general. Neoliberalism and casualization are not an opportunity for basic income. They are a problem for basic income. So we should not rush to be accepted or agree with every global agency, but we should critically scrutinize their case or argument for basic income, which increasingly aligns with this proposal for flattening the economic security system, because it's not in our interest to be part of the problem of neoliberalism by essentially propping it up around the edges and accept lowering standards as the route to equality. So I'd say any country that has developed mental capability and risk pooling systems in place, don't let any agency, global agency, tell you to simply flatten them. That's the devil's deal. It's a rush to a low-level equality that lacks substance. And I don't think that's what basic income ought to be about. But more importantly, I don't think it is what it is about. Because the real evidence shows us that countries with developmental capability and risk pooling systems are more likely to innovate in the direction of more secure rights, of upscaling. It is in that space, I think, that basic income ought to be argued for, not outside that space. And I think we can and we need to pick up those lessons from